My name's Tyler, I'm 26, and I've always been the quiet one in the family. The one who doesn't argue, doesn't talk back, just nods and keeps the peace while everyone else raises their voices. Growing up, I learned early that silence was safer, especially when you're dealing with people like my dad. He was the kind of man who saw obedience as respect and anything less as rebellion. And my mom, she just followed his lead, even when it hurt me. But this story really begins a few months ago, right after I landed my first stable job as an accountant for a mid-sized logistics firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. I was proud. After years of struggling through school, paying off debts, and working part-time shifts wherever I could, I finally felt like I had control over my life. For once, the paycheck was mine. At least, that's what I thought. When I told my parents I'd gotten the job, my dad clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good. Now you can start giving back." I thought he meant small things, helping out with groceries or taking them to dinner once in a while. I didn't realize he meant everything. See, my older sister, Haley, had just had a baby. Her boyfriend left as soon as she announced she was pregnant, and since then, she's been living back home with our parents. I felt bad for her, genuinely. She was only 28, but she looked tired all the time, not just from motherhood, but from the way she'd settled into this endless loop of depending on everyone else to clean up her messes. My parents doted on her like she was made of glass. They did her laundry, cooked her meals, took turns babysitting, and never once told her no. Meanwhile, every time I came over, I'd hear some version of, "Haley's been through a lot. Be understanding, Tyler." At first I brought over baby supplies when I could, lent her money for formula once or twice, and even helped set up a small savings account for her kid. But as soon as I got that steady paycheck, something changed in how my dad looked at me. Like I was no longer his son, just a walking wallet. It started one Saturday morning when I stopped by their house. The baby was crying somewhere in the background, my mom was making coffee, and my dad was reading the paper. Without looking up, he said, "We need to talk about your finances." That sentence made me freeze. "My finances?" I asked, half laughing because it sounded absurd. "Yeah," he said, folding the newspaper carefully and setting it aside. "You're earning now, and this family's been through a lot. It's time you start contributing properly." I thought he meant maybe rent money for Haley or some household support. So I asked, "How much are we talking about?" My mom looked at my dad nervously, like she didn't agree but didn't dare say it. My dad's tone hardened. "Your paycheck belongs to the family now, Tyler. Especially Haley. She's raising a baby, and that's not cheap." I stared at him, completely thrown. "Wait, you're saying my whole paycheck?" He frowned, like I was being ungrateful. "Of course not all of it. You can keep enough for your bus fare and lunch. The rest will go through us, so we can make sure it's used responsibly. That's what families do." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was insane. "Dad, I've got rent, bills, my own expenses." He cut me off sharply. "You're not special. Everyone sacrifices for family. We helped you through school, didn't we? It's time to return the favor." That hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to speak, but my mom jumped in softly, trying to smooth things over. "Your father just means it's your turn to support Haley for a while. She needs help, Tyler. You're doing well now, and she's struggling." Haley walked into the kitchen at that exact moment, baby on her hip, wearing one of those smug little smiles that said she already knew about this conversation. "Dad told me you'd understand," she said. "Thank you for helping out. It really means a lot." That's when I realized it wasn't a discussion. They'd already decided for me. I didn't argue that day. I just stood there, heart pounding, and muttered, "Yeah, sure," because I knew arguing wouldn't get me anywhere. I left shortly after, saying I had work to do, and drove home in silence. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream. But years of being raised under my dad's thumb had taught me to swallow my anger until it turned into something quieter, something sharper. Over the next few weeks, things escalated fast. My dad started calling every few days to ask when I was sending money. Haley texted me her budget breakdowns, diapers, formula, new clothes, and somehow always a few miscellaneous expenses that never made sense. When I hesitated, my dad would remind me of all they'd done for me. "We didn't have to pay your tuition," he'd say. "We could have let you struggle." And the guilt worked, for a while. I started transferring small amounts, telling myself it was temporary. But temporary turned into expected. Every payday they'd ask. Every delay, they'd guilt trip. And Haley, she started acting like it was her right. She once called me just to say, "Hey, can you send it today instead of Friday? I want to take mom and dad out for lunch as a thank you." That made my blood boil. My money being used to celebrate them for manipulating me. I tried to talk to them again, calmly, explaining that I couldn't keep doing this. I told them I needed to save for my own place, that I was trying to build a future. My dad didn't even let me finish. "Your future doesn't matter if your family's suffering," he said. "You're being selfish." That night, I sat alone in my apartment and thought about everything I'd been through. All the years I'd spent trying to earn their respect, their approval, their love. And for what? To be treated like an ATM. I decided I wasn't going to give in anymore. But I also knew I couldn't just confront them. Not yet. They'd twist it, make me the villain, and somehow convince everyone I'd abandoned my family. So instead, I went quiet. I told them my job had cut hours and stopped sending money altogether. Haley whined. My dad lectured. My mom pleaded. I just kept my answers short and neutral. Then something happened that changed everything. Something I didn't expect. My grandfather, my dad's father, called me one evening out of the blue. He's old school, the kind of man who doesn't waste words, so when he called, I assumed it was something serious. "Tyler," he said, voice gruff but warm. "I heard there's some trouble in the family. Your father's been talking." My stomach twisted. "What kind of trouble?" He paused for a long moment, then said, "He's been telling everyone you're refusing to help your sister, that you've become selfish since you started working." I felt that familiar anger rise up again. "That's not true. He stopped me gently. "I know, son. I know your father. I just wanted to hear your side." So I told him everything. How my parents had demanded my paycheck. How they treated Haley like royalty while expecting me to sacrifice everything. I didn't sugarcoat it. And by the time I finished, there was a silence on the other end of the line that made my heart race. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed. It wasn't just disappointment. It was fury held tightly in check. "Your father doesn't know what family means," he said quietly. "But I do. Leave this to me." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. But over the next few weeks, something started to shift. Whispers in the family, tension at gatherings, phone calls my parents refused to explain. And then a letter arrived at my door. It wasn't from my parents. It was from my grandfather. When that letter from my grandfather arrived, I didn't open it right away. I just stared at the envelope sitting on my kitchen table, my name written in his neat, deliberate handwriting. It had that old, formal feel, not something sent in haste, but something meant. I finally tore it open that night after work, my hand still trembling from nerves. Inside was a single folded letter and a cashier's check. The check was for $5,000. The letter read, "Tyler, I don't want you struggling because of your father's mistakes. Consider this a small cushion while I handle things my way. Don't confront them. Don't tell them about this. Just focus on yourself for now. You've earned that right." Grandpa. I sat there for a long time, just rereading the words. There was something unsettling about how calmly he'd written, "I'll handle things my way." He wasn't a man who made idle promises. When he said he'd take care of something, it usually meant someone was going to regret crossing him. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with the money. I tucked it into my desk drawer, told myself I'd save it. But over the next few days, I started to notice how the atmosphere around my family was shifting, especially toward me. My dad started calling less, which should have been a relief. But when he did call, his tone was clipped, defensive. My mom sounded nervous, like she was tiptoeing around something. Haley, on the other hand, was just as entitled as ever. One night, she texted me out of nowhere. "You've really disappointed Dad. He said you're turning into one of those people, selfish, greedy. I can't believe you'd let your niece go without what she needs." I almost laughed. Her niece was wearing designer baby clothes, while I was calculating how to stretch my paycheck until the next one. Still, I didn't reply. I didn't have the energy for her dramatics. 2 weeks later, my dad called and asked me to come by the house for dinner. His tone was unnervingly polite. I should have known something was off right then. But I went, partly because I missed my mom and partly because I wanted to see what was going on behind the scenes. When I arrived, Haley was already there, sitting at the table with the baby in a high chair. My mom looked tense, moving around the kitchen like she was trying to hold everything together. My dad sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, watching me. The moment I sat down, he started. "So," he said, his voice low but sharp, "you've been talking to my father." I froze. What? He leaned forward. Don't play dumb. He called me last week, lecturing me about family values and how I'm treating you. You went running to him, didn't you? I didn't run to him, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He called me. He asked what was going on, so I told him. My dad slammed his hand on the table, making the baby startle and cry. You had no right. What happens in this family stays in this family. You made me look like a fool to my own father. Mom tried to intervene. Honey, please. But he waved her off. His face was red, and I could feel his anger radiating across the table. Haley smirked from her seat. Well, maybe if you weren't being selfish, Grandpa wouldn't have had to get involved, she said. You could have just kept helping instead of making this a big deal. That was the first time I snapped. Helping? Haley, I was paying your bills. I was covering your groceries while you sat around doing nothing. She gasped, offended, like I'd just cursed at her. I'm raising a baby. That's not nothing. Yeah, and plenty of single mothers do that without draining their brother dry. My dad slammed his fist again. Enough. You will not disrespect your sister in this house. I stood up slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. No, I think I've disrespected myself long enough. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then my dad's voice dropped to something colder. You're not part of this family anymore if you can't understand loyalty. I left without saying another word. That night, I got a call from my mom. Her voice was trembling. Tyler, your father didn't mean it. He's just upset. Please don't let this drive you away. I wanted to believe her, but I could hear him shouting in the background. Something about ungrateful kids and disrespect. That told me everything I needed to know. The next few weeks were tense. I tried focusing on work, tried pretending none of it bothered me, but it did. The silence from them was heavy. Until one day, I checked my bank account and saw something that made my stomach drop. A withdrawal. $1,200 gone. I stared at the transaction details. It was from a joint account I'd opened years ago with my mom, back when I was in college and needed her co-signature for rent. I'd completely forgotten it still existed. Apparently, they hadn't. I called her immediately. Mom, did you take money from my account? She went quiet. Then, softly, your father needed it for Haley's expenses. We thought you wouldn't mind. You thought I wouldn't mind? I said, my voice breaking. That's my savings. You had no right. She started crying, whispering apologies, but I couldn't even listen. My hands were shaking so bad I had to sit down. That was my breaking point. Not just the money, but the betrayal. The realization that they truly didn't see me as a person anymore, just a source of income. I spent that night drafting an email to the bank to close the account and remove their access. Then, for good measure, I moved all my funds to a new bank entirely. I didn't tell them. I didn't even tell my mom. I just cut it off quietly, the same way I'd been cutting pieces of them out of my life for months. But things didn't stay quiet for long. A few days later, Haley showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there with the baby in a stroller, her expression tight and indignant. Really classy move, she said, crossing her arms. Cutting Mom and Dad off. You made Mom cry, you know. I sighed. Haley, I'm not doing this anymore. You owe them, Tyler, she snapped. They supported you for years. You think you'd be where you are without them? You wouldn't even have that job. I got that job on my own. She laughed, that same fake, condescending laugh that had always gotten under my skin. Sure you did. You think Grandpa would be proud of this? You think you can just walk away from family? That last part made me pause. What does Grandpa have to do with this? She smirked. Oh, he knows. Dad told him everything. He said Grandpa's furious, says he's cutting you out of his will. My heart sank. I didn't even care about the money, but the idea that my grandfather, the one person who had believed me, had turned against me hurt more than I wanted to admit. She must have seen it on my face, because her tone softened, almost pitying. You should just apologize. Dad said he might let it go if you send them something, a peace offering. I closed the door in her face. That night, I sat in the dark of my living room, phone in my hand, staring at my grandfather's number. I wanted to call him, to ask if it was true, but something told me to wait. The next morning, my question was answered, not by a phone call, but by another letter. This one wasn't handwritten. It was typed, crisp, and direct. It was from my grandfather's lawyer. It said he wanted to meet with me privately. At first, I thought it was a trap. Maybe my dad was behind it. But when I arrived at the lawyer's office, my grandfather was there in person, sitting in the corner, his cane resting beside him. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp. "Sit down, Tyler," he said. I did. He didn't waste time. "Your father told me his version," he said. Then I heard Haley's. But something didn't add up. So I did some checking of my own. He leaned forward and placed a folder on the desk. "Bank statements. Credit records. Do you know what I found?" I shook my head slowly. "Your father has been transferring money from your old joint account for months. Thousands of dollars. And not just to Haley. Some of it went to personal expenses, his car payments, restaurant bills, even a vacation fund." My stomach twisted. "He what?" Grandpa nodded grimly. "He used you, Tyler, and then lied to everyone to cover it up." I couldn't even speak. All that anger I'd been holding back for years, it just turned cold. Then my grandfather said something that made my chest tighten. I gave him one chance to explain himself. He lied to my face. So now, I'm done with him. He stood up slowly, gripping his cane, and looked at me with that quiet fire in his eyes. "I want you to know, Tyler, I'm not going to let this go. Your father thinks he can manipulate people forever, but I'm about to show him that actions have consequences." He placed his hand on my shoulder, firm and deliberate. "I'm changing everything." I didn't know what that meant yet. But deep down, I could feel it. Something huge was coming. Something that would tear our family apart once and for all. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of that. After that meeting with my grandfather, I went home in a daze. The idea that my father had been siphoning money from me for months, all while pretending to be the righteous, demanding parent, felt like a punch I couldn't recover from. I sat on my couch for hours, staring at the floor, trying to process everything. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was about the years of manipulation, the way they'd always treated me like I owed them my life. That realization made my chest ache. For a moment, I felt smaller than I'd ever felt before, like every decision I'd ever made had been under a microscope, every act of kindness twisted into proof of my indebtedness. I'd hit rock bottom, emotionally and mentally. I didn't want to answer my phone, didn't want to check my emails, didn't even want to leave my apartment. The baby photos Haley sent didn't feel innocent anymore. They were taunts, reminders of how I was supposed to sacrifice for a family that only saw me as a tool. And for the first time in years, I let myself cry. Not because I was weak, but because I had been holding all of it in for so long that it threatened to swallow me whole. The following weeks were a haze. I quit going out, my sleep became sporadic, and the office felt like a prison even though I liked my work. I started questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was I really being selfish, as Haley said? Then I remembered my grandfather's words. "Your father used you." He lied. He manipulated. And that memory sparked something else, a spark I hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. Not blind anger, but sharp, precise anger that made me sit up straighter. I realized I had two choices: stay crushed under their weight, or quietly rebuild my life on my terms. The answer was obvious. I started small. I made a strict budget for myself, tracking every penny. I set up a separate account where no one, not my parents, not Haley, could touch my money. I stopped responding to texts from my dad and sister unless it was absolutely necessary, and I started making my apartment feel like my sanctuary again. Clean, organized, and mine. It might not have seemed like much to anyone else, but to me, it was a small declaration of independence. Next, I focused on work. I poured myself into projects, taking on additional responsibilities that went beyond my job description. My boss noticed. One afternoon, she called me into her office. "Tyler, I've been impressed with your work lately. We're considering you for a lead position in the next quarter." I felt a mix of pride and disbelief. All those years of struggling, being overlooked, being treated like I was expendable, it was finally paying off. I accepted the challenge, diving into the new role with everything I had. I realized that for the first time, I was building a life that wasn't dictated by anyone else. But while I was quietly climbing, the family drama didn't stop. Haley had somehow learned about the money my grandfather had sent me, though she didn't know it came with strings attached, and her entitlement spiraled. She started texting constantly, demanding contributions for clothes, toys, and emergency expenses that she never bothered to define. When I didn't respond immediately, she resorted to passive-aggressive messages about how I was abandoning her and how family doesn't act this way. It hurt, but I learned to keep my distance. I blocked her on social media, ignored her calls, and let my grandfather handle any family-related fallout. That was a turning point for me. I realized that I didn't have to justify myself to anyone who had consistently tried to manipulate me. My self-worth didn't come from their approval, it came from me. Slowly, life started to feel lighter. I started saving aggressively, investing in a small portfolio I'd researched endlessly. I even signed up for a weekend coding class, something I'd always wanted to do, and in my free time, I began developing a side business. It was small at first, selling organizational tools and accounting templates online, but I loved it. For the first time, I felt genuinely proud of something I'd built entirely by myself. Work, savings, side projects, it all added up. I began noticing a quiet confidence growing inside me, one that had nothing to do with my parents' approval or Haley's drama. I was becoming my own person, and it felt incredible. But even as I was building this new life, the remnants of the old family tension lingered. One Saturday, I got a text from my mom. "We need to talk. It's about Grandpa. Please come over." My stomach dropped. Grandpa had always been my ally, the one family member I trusted completely. Why would she call me about him? I hesitated but agreed, figuring it might be nothing, or at least a chance to hear him out directly. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Mom opened the door, her expression unreadable. "He wants to see you," she said, leading me into the study. My grandfather was there, seated behind his massive desk, but he wasn't smiling. Not that he ever smiled much, but there was a tension in the room, a weight that made me uneasy. "Sit, Tyler," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent I hadn't heard before. "I've been monitoring the situation closely." I sat, trying to read him. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Your father and Haley have made a few mistakes lately. Mistakes that need to be addressed properly." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He opened a folder on his desk, pushing it toward me. Inside were financial records, receipts, and bank statements. Dozens of pages showing months of misappropriated money, hidden expenses, and even questionable loans that my dad had taken out in my name without telling me. "Do you see this?" he asked. "Your father has been lying not just to you, but to the entire family. And Haley, well, she's been complicit, whether intentionally or not." I flipped through the papers, my jaw tightening with every page. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft, manipulation, and deception woven together over years. Grandpa leaned forward. "I gave your father the benefit of the doubt. I thought perhaps he was struggling. But he's been using you." And when I confronted him, he lied. That's when I decided it was time for action. "What kind of action?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to rebuild your life fully independent from them," he said. "I'll provide support where necessary, but this isn't about money anymore. It's about restoring the balance, showing them that loyalty and respect are earned, not demanded." Over the next few weeks, I began to notice subtle changes. My father started calling less frequently, and when he did, it was always in short, clipped sentences. Haley tried messaging me multiple times, but I didn't respond. Even my mom seemed uncertain, like she was tiptoeing around me. I was no longer the scared, obedient son. I was Tyler, the independent adult who wasn't afraid to draw boundaries. During this time, my side business started growing. Orders came in steadily, and soon I hired a small part-time assistant to help with logistics. Work at the accounting firm was rewarding, and the promotion I'd received a few months earlier gave me a sense of authority and accomplishment I'd never known. I also reconnected with old friends I'd drifted away from because of family obligations. Dinner with them became a routine, sometimes quiet nights of talking about work, other times spontaneous weekends away. For the first time, I realized that I could enjoy life without feeling guilty for it. Then came the first hint that my grandfather's influence was making waves in the family. My dad called me one evening, his voice low and tight. "Tyler, we need to talk." I hesitated, but didn't answer. The next day, I received a small package at my apartment. Inside was a note from Grandpa. "They're testing the waters. Don't engage. Wait for my signal." It was clear that he wasn't just protecting me. He was orchestrating something that would shake the foundation of our family to its core. I sat back in my chair, looking around my apartment, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. For the first time, I realized that while I'd been rebuilding quietly, patiently, my grandfather had been setting the stage for the ultimate reckoning. And I was ready. After weeks of quiet rebuilding, I finally started seeing the full picture. My grandfather had been dropping subtle hints, guiding me without interfering directly, letting me learn how to handle my family's manipulations on my own. He wasn't just protecting me. He was teaching me how to prepare, how to gather leverage, and how to hit when the time was right. That realization lit a fire in me I hadn't felt since discovering the full extent of my father's betrayal. For the first time, I understood that revenge wasn't about screaming, confronting, or letting emotions run wild. It was about control, patience, and precision. I began mapping out every aspect of the situation. I started with the finances. Thanks to my grandfather's intervention, I had copies of all the bank statements, credit reports, and loan documents that my father had manipulated over the years. I spent nights combing through them, highlighting discrepancies, fraudulent withdrawals, and expenses that were clearly unrelated to Haley or the household. Every little detail became ammunition, a piece of the puzzle I could use when the time came. I discovered credit cards in my name I didn't know existed, late fees my father had paid from other accounts to cover his tracks, and even a few suspicious loans he'd taken out at my credit limit, pretending they were for Haley's expenses. It was astonishing how much he'd relied on my obedience, assuming I'd never notice. Next, I focused on Haley. I knew she'd been complicit, whether deliberately or because she had been conditioned to demand and take. I started quietly documenting her spending, the way she presented needs as emergencies, and how she leveraged my father's authority to pressure me. Every designer baby outfit, every unplanned trip to the store, every text she sent me demanding contributions, I saved it. I started compiling a digital folder, receipts, screenshots, bank statements, and even some photos showing the contrast between the luxurious life she claimed to struggle with and the reality of her living conditions. Meanwhile, I carefully rebuilt bridges with friends and colleagues who had influence or expertise that could help me. There was Clara, a coworker at the firm who handled compliance and internal audits. She had an eye for inconsistencies and a quiet, calculating mind. I shared the situation with her, under the pretense that I needed advice on unusual financial discrepancies. Without prying too much, she offered strategies to document everything so it could hold up if legal action became necessary. I also reached out to two of my oldest friends, Jordan and May, who were business savvy and quick thinking. I explained, in broad strokes, what my family had been doing to me and how I wanted to make sure I wasn't caught off guard again. They didn't ask for proof. They'd seen me get walked over by my family for years, and they knew my temperament. They agreed to help me brainstorm ways to turn the tables strategically, making sure any action I took wouldn't backfire. The next step was psychological. I studied my family's patterns, how they reacted to guilt, how they manipulated situations to get what they wanted, and how they justified their actions. I began imagining scenarios in which I could play them at their own game. Haley, for example, always flaunted the support she received from me and my grandfather without realizing that flaunting it could work against her. My father, meanwhile, had a predictable ego. He needed to appear in control, to dominate conversations, and to look morally superior. These were weaknesses I could exploit. One evening, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by spreadsheets, folders, and notes, I realized the most powerful tool I had wasn't the money or the evidence alone. It was information. I had amassed knowledge about every lie, every misappropriation, every manipulation, and I could control when and how it surfaced. That was when the plan started to crystallize. I wouldn't confront them directly. I wouldn't yell or accuse. I would wait, and I would act only when the timing guaranteed maximum impact. I also began testing the waters subtly. I'd send Haley small sums of money that were intentionally short or late, watching how she reacted. Every complaint, every whiny text, every panic call I ignored became data. I cataloged it. My father started noticing the resistance and tried to confront me a few times, but I remained calm, composed, and noncommittal. I didn't give them anything to pin down emotionally. Instead, I observed. I analyzed. I recorded. One night, I received another call from my grandfather. His voice was calm, but the undercurrent of authority was unmistakable. "Tyler, it's time you understand that a trap only works if the bait is irresistible. Your father and Haley are greedy, predictable. They'll take the bait if they think it benefits them." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I understand." "Good. But remember," he continued, "this isn't just about exposing them. It's about restoring balance. They've spent years thinking they could walk over you. This ends quietly, efficiently, and permanently. You don't get angry. You don't rush. You wait for the perfect moment. Over the next week, I started manipulating circumstances subtly. I made a point of making my work life and personal finances look less stable than they really were, letting them think I was still vulnerable and under their control. I let Haley believe I was struggling to keep up with contributions, and I allowed my father to feel smug, confident that he still held the upper hand. Every interaction was carefully calculated. A small smile here, a neutral tone there, an appearance of compliance that concealed the full extent of my awareness. At the same time, I was fortifying my own resources. I had saved aggressively, invested wisely, and even secured a small line of credit to use if needed. I'd hired May to audit my side business, ensuring all revenue streams were above board, creating a paper trail that could stand up legally. I had legal counsel ready in case anything escalated, and I knew exactly how to present evidence without implicating myself in any wrongdoing. Every detail was planned, every contingency considered. I also began observing family gatherings more closely. At dinner, I noticed patterns I hadn't before. The way my father controlled conversations, the way Haley positioned herself to draw sympathy, and the way my mother tried to mediate without asserting authority. I started identifying allies I could influence. My uncle, who had always been quietly skeptical of my father's decisions, seemed like someone who could be swayed if I presented him with the right information. Even a few distant cousins who were aware of Haley's excessive lifestyle could be helpful in amplifying the narrative when the time came. Then came the perfect opportunity. Haley had a baby shower planned, and my parents insisted I attend. They framed it as a family celebration, but I knew better. They wanted to flaunt my contributions and guilt-trip me into giving more money on the spot. I decided to go, but only because it would be the perfect stage to set my plan into motion. In the days leading up to the shower, I made subtle moves. I accidentally left some financial documents where Haley could see them, hinting at expenses she hadn't accounted for. I made sure my phone was full of screenshots of her complaints and my father's manipulations, so I could reference them later if needed. I even spoke with Clara at work about an angle for verifying transactions quietly during the event. She suggested I subtly gather confirmation of fraudulent transfers while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. By the time the day of the shower arrived, I was calm, collected, and fully prepared. I wasn't the scared, obedient son anymore. I wasn't the quiet provider they could manipulate at will. I was a man who had been underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed. And now, I had the tools, the allies, and the knowledge to turn the tables. I walked into the house that morning, dressed professionally, carrying nothing but a small folder I'd prepared with critical information. The living room was full of family and friends, all laughing, chatting, and enjoying themselves. Haley rushed to greet me, baby in arms, wearing that same smug smile that used to make me grind my teeth. My father was nearby, surveying the room like a king presiding over his kingdom. I smiled politely, said hello, and took a seat near my grandfather, who gave me a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that the next moves were mine to make. As the party went on, I observed, waited, and calculated. Every laugh, every boast, every mention of money or contribution became another piece of data. I could see the cracks forming already. Haley's frustration at my calm demeanor, my father's subtle irritation at my refusal to engage in his usual guilt-tripping. My mother hovered nervously, clearly sensing the tension but unsure how to intervene. It was perfect. Every variable was accounted for, every reaction predicted. I wasn't rushing anything. I was letting the pieces fall exactly where they needed to. And I knew, deep down, that when the time came, the fall would be spectacular. The kind of fall that left no room for excuses, denials, or manipulations. The day of the baby shower arrived like any other, the house buzzing with people, laughter, and the faint scent of flowers my mother had insisted on arranging. I walked in carrying only my folder and a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. Haley rushed over immediately, cooing over her baby, and my father trailed behind, trying to appear casual, like he hadn't been seething for weeks over my resistance. My mother hovered near the kitchen, nervously wiping her hands on a towel, clearly aware that tension was simmering just beneath the surface. I took a seat near my grandfather, who gave me a subtle nod, the kind that told me he trusted the plan I had set into motion. It wasn't about dramatic confrontations or shouting matches. It was about precision, about showing them that all their manipulation and greed could no longer control me. I opened my folder, pulling out printed copies of the bank statements, the screenshots, the receipts, and the detailed tracking of every questionable expense my father had made in my name. I had even included a concise summary showing the discrepancy between what he claimed I owed and what he had actually taken. Haley noticed immediately, peeking over my shoulder. "What's that?" she asked, her tone curious but cautious. I smiled politely. "Just some notes I've been keeping, documenting finances and contributions. I thought it might be useful to review before the shower." She laughed nervously. "You've really been keeping track of all that?" I nodded, calm. "Yes. I thought it was important to be thorough." At that moment, my father moved closer, frowning at the folder. "Tyler, what is that? Are you implying something?" I leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I'm just presenting the facts. I've been meticulous. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every expense, it's all documented." A hush fell over the room. Some of the relatives began glancing at each other, sensing the tension, though they didn't know the full story. My grandfather rose from his chair, walking over slowly. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Let's review this together," he said, his tone calm but commanding. I spread the documents across the table, showing them chronologically, with notes highlighting how my father had used funds meant for household support and my sister's baby to cover personal expenses, vacations, and even gambling-related debts. Haley's face turned pale as I pointed out purchases she had insisted were necessities for the baby that were, in reality, extravagant or unnecessary. "Wait," Haley stammered. I didn't know." "You didn't know?" I said evenly. "Or you just didn't care?" "Because the pattern is clear. Every time there was money available, it was used to cover things that had nothing to do with the baby. And when I raised concerns, I was told I was selfish or ungrateful." My father's face reddened, but he tried to maintain control. This is exaggerated. You're twisting things." I stayed calm, turning to my grandfather. "Grandpa, would you like to explain what you found when you reviewed Dad's accounts?" He stepped forward, voice steady and authoritative. I didn't want to believe it at first. I hoped there had been some misunderstanding. But the truth is undeniable. Tyler's father has been taking money from him for months under false pretenses. And Haley has been complicit, benefiting from this misappropriation. The room went silent. My father opened his mouth to argue, but my grandfather cut him off. "Not a word. I have copies of every transaction, every statement, and a legal review confirming all discrepancies. I have already begun the process of correcting the financial damage and ensuring Tyler retains control over his own finances." Haley's expression shifted from shock to guilt to fear. "Grandpa, please, I didn't." "You did participate," my grandfather said, calm but stern. "Whether knowingly or out of ignorance, you accepted benefits under false pretenses. That stops now." I stayed quiet, letting the tension build. My father was fumbling for words, his ego no longer protecting him. "Tyler, this is a betrayal," he spat. I shook my head, my voice steady. "No, you betrayed me first, every year, every expectation, every manipulation. I just waited until I had the tools to expose it calmly, efficiently, and without letting emotions dictate the outcome." The relatives who had been gathered for the shower were now fully aware something serious was happening. A few whispered, exchanging glances as my grandfather methodically explained the findings. Some of my dad's friends and family members began to murmur about how long Tyler had been patient, how meticulous and composed he had been despite years of manipulation. Then came the final blow. I had enlisted Clara and May to gather independent verification of the financial discrepancies. Clara quietly presented a detailed audit showing every irregularity, all traced back to my father's mismanagement and deceptive transfers. May displayed a timeline linking transactions to lavish purchases, highlighting expenses that were falsely justified as necessary for Haley's baby. Haley's face crumpled, her smug confidence replaced by panic. "Tyler, I didn't know it was this bad," she said, voice trembling. "You did know," I said quietly. "You just didn't care because it benefited you." My father tried to regain control, but every relative in the room had seen the evidence. His authority had crumbled. He stammered, defensive, pleading for explanations that no one accepted anymore. My mother, overwhelmed by guilt and shame, couldn't even look at me. She quietly retreated to the kitchen, silently acknowledging that the scales had shifted permanently. My grandfather turned to me, his voice firm. "Tyler, you've handled this perfectly. Calm, patient, meticulous. You've exposed the truth without losing your composure or moral high ground. This is how you take back control." I nodded, feeling a surge of satisfaction I had never experienced before. Every year of obedience, every dollar taken from me, every manipulation, it had all led to this moment. The fallout was immediate. My father was confronted by the relatives and friends present, forced to apologize publicly for his actions, and agree to repay misappropriated funds. Haley was confronted as well, and although she tried to rationalize her behavior, it was clear to everyone that she had enabled the deception. My mother, quietly remorseful, admitted her failures in front of everyone, and although there was tension, it was grounded in accountability rather than manipulation. By the end of the gathering, I realized something profound. This wasn't just revenge. It was restoration. I hadn't needed to yell, fight, or manipulate in turn. I had used patience, strategy, and intelligence to correct the balance that had been skewed for years. I had taken back what was mine, not just the finances, but my dignity, my autonomy, and my self-respect. Weeks later, life returned to a new normal. My father had retreated into his own guilt. My sister had become more cautious and less entitled, and my mother began to see me as an equal rather than a perpetual subordinate. I continued to grow my side business, advanced at work, and strengthened relationships with friends and allies who had supported me quietly throughout the ordeal. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that I was not powerless. I had learned that control and respect are not given. They are earned, defended, and, when necessary, reclaimed. Sitting in my apartment one evening, reviewing the latest orders for my business, I thought back to all the moments of doubt and despair, the nights I had cried alone, the pangs of guilt my father tried to force on me, the manipulation I had endured. And I smiled, quietly, without arrogance, without malice. Because finally, after years of being underestimated and dismissed, I had taken everything they thought they could control from me, and I had done it calmly, methodically, and perfectly. And for the first time, I knew I would never let anyone take that power from me again. It was over. The scales were balanced, and I was free.